Good afternoon. It's January 27th. We are here for the Planning, Housing, and Parks Committee. We are here to discuss one item today, Zoning Text Amendment 2403, Overlay Zones, Great Seneca Life Sciences.
Monitor
Overlay zone.
seventh floor
The
rather
zoning
than
text amendment was introduced by me when I was council president at the request of the planning board on June 11th, and it will establish a new Great Seneca Life Sciences overlay zone, which is the implementation really of the plan that the committee and that the council took up significantly last year and really is a main part of that implementation. So here to discuss that, we're going to call council staff, and we have council staff at the table. I was thinking about calling you up to the table. It's good to be here, still getting my sea legs on the 7th floor. We haven't been up here in a while. And board chair and planning board and planning staff as needed. So with that, let me turn it over to you, Ms. Nadeau.
Okay, good afternoon, committee. So ZTA 2403 will establish a new Great Seneca Life Sciences overlay zone.
It's
design. So the public hearing was on July 16th, 2024. The testimony was largely in support, but there were several amendments requested. Those amendments are all discussed later in the staff report, so please hold for that. The planning board requested introduction of this ZTA, so unsurprisingly recommend support. They have one amendment which I will discuss later on as well. The planning board reviewed the climate assessment. This was a more in-depth one than usual, some interesting points here. First, they estimated that total greenhouse gas emissions will be higher at build-out because for this plan specifically, large areas of surface parking are going to be replaced with development and redevelopment. And then also, because more people will be coming into the area, there'll be more energy used for heating, cooling, and lighting of homes and offices, as well as transportation. But what this ZTA does is incentivize public benefits, and many of those public benefits reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So that's the climate assessment. Next, OLO did a racial equity social justice impact statement, which was favorable because this could increase the supply of affordable housing. So there is a list of, or a summary of some of the provisions in the ZTA on page 3. Generally, what the ZTA will do is allow more height and density with the provision of public benefits and make some changes to parking requirements, specifically that parking minimums do not apply and that surface vehicle parking will be prohibited between a building and a public street. So this, as I noted, the plan was adopted last summer. The reason for the delay here is around that same time, planning transmitted the incentive zoning update, which this committee reviewed in December, I believe 2 dates in December. So council staff's recommendation had been, because this ZTA implements some of the provisions, although separate, the plan was for PHP to review incentive zoning and then come back to this ZTA. For everyone's awareness, that incentive zoning ZTA is forthcoming. Council and planning staff are still currently working on it. But we thought since there were no bold or large changes to the incentive zoning update, we can go ahead and implement this overlay so that developers can start to take advantage of it. So as written in the ZTA, all projects that are above 0.5 FAR are going to be optional method, and then any density over that, whether mapped or additional, will be considered incentive density. And the way incentive density is going to work is a tiered system that provides credits ranging from 0.25 to 1 FAR, depending on how expensive and how complex the benefit is. On page 4, I did a kind of quick overview of how some of those public benefits works, some of the examples of things that you can provide. There are housing incentives, there's key infrastructure projects, including parks and roads, there's spaces for smaller life science companies, and the way that this is going to work is a developer will figure out how much FAR they want to get, and in exchange, there's a menu of options, and they can mix and match all the different categories to get there. And then, of course, how big the project is determines how much additional density you will get. So that is the ZTA as introduced, and if there's no questions, I will move on to the amendments. Okay, so first was testimony from Trammell Crow Company about the incentive density requirement. The request was that you only have to apply for incentive density if you're going above your mapped FAR. Council staff recommends against this amendment because that's generally not how we do public benefits in the other underlying zones. The goal here was to set the threshold for this overlay zone, not to change the LSC underlying. So council staff does not recommend an amendment here.
Unless there's any interest from council members to introduce an amendment, I will continue.
Okay. Next, this is the amendment that Planning Board had requested, as well as some of the testimony about parking lots. So there was testimony that numerous existing parking lots are going to become non-conforming, and that will also impact the ability to do expansions and renovations, because that's what happens when you have a non-conforming use. It's basically saying, this is a legal use, we know the law changed on you, but you can't expand or do major renovations anymore. The testimony came from Guardian Realty Management as well as the Adventist Hospital, asking for a tweak to this. Planning Board's recommendation, which council staff agrees with, is to just add the word new. So it will now say, new surface vehicle parking is prohibited between a building and a public or private street, and that language is on page 5.
Appreciate it. I think that was the intent. The goal here is to move in the direction of the vision of the plan, but not to penalize any progress from being able to be made or allowing for progress to get in the way by seeking perfection of the overarching goal. So I think this seems to make sense. Without objection, we'll agree with the consensus, which is always good. So without objection, we will accept that amendment.
The third requested amendment is about the location of parking. This was from Adventist Hospital. In the ZTA, one of the Tier 1 public benefits requires placing all on-site parking below ground grade or wrapping all structured parking. For many reasons, this would not work for the hospital. Council staff does note here that this is on the list of items you could choose for Tier 1, so the hospital would not have to do this to expand or make changes. They would just pick different public benefits. So no amendment. Council staff does not recommend an amendment here either.
So the point being raised here is it's a legitimate concern that Adventist Hospital has raised, but it's not a parking obligation. It's one of the ways in which to resolve the issue, and they could move forward with a different one that would be more reasonable.
Correct, yeah. They could choose one of the other Tier 1 benefits. I think in each category, there's about, I want to say 5 to 10 different benefits you could choose between. So there will be hopefully plenty of other options for them to choose from.
And has planning communicated that directly with Adventist just to assuage their concern?
Hi, Maren Hill for the record. Yes, we have talked to Adventist. We went over the ZTA with them as proposed. And I think that we made it clear that this is a menu, so it is optional, and that there are lots of paths to get to the desired FAR. There's not any single item that is required. So if you, as you review the incentive zoning update, you'll see that there are, benefits related to housing, to sustainability in the environment, as well as to infrastructure and design, and this is just one of many. So we did have that conversation. I don't remember if it was specifically about this parking, but that in general, no single item is required for further future development.
Did that happen before or after they submitted this testimony?
I believe it was before they submitted
Yeah,
this.
so it sounds like it wasn't clear because they still are concerned. So I would suggest, I don't think we need an amendment, it doesn't sound like, because there already are other options, but I would suggest just a direct conversation to walk them through what options are available to ensure that they're aware that there are other avenues to satisfy the requirements.
We're happy to follow up with them.
Sounds good. Okay. I don't think there is an interest in moving forward with any amendment here based on that, but I do think a conversation would be helpful and is certainly warranted, so please follow up on that, and if you could just circle back with us to confirm that that conversation has occurred, I think that would be helpful and when, just so that we know that it has happened. With that, let's continue.
Okay, so the next requested amendment is about warehouse and storage uses. So this was an amendment to allow warehouses and storage if associated with biotech. So as introduced, self-storage and storage facility are not allowed uses in the overlay except as non-conforming uses. In a different section of the code defining medical/scientific manufacturing and production, the reason it's phrased that way is I know in the county we use the word biotech a lot, and that's not actually a specific use in the zoning ordinance. This is usually the use that's being referred to. But that definition says a building used for the manufacturing, compounding, processing, assembling, or packaging, including incidental storage. So some incidental storage is allowed as part of that biotech use. So the request here was to just clarify that. Council staff admittedly had some concerns about this at first because self-storage is actually its own definition, so the ZTA is not changing that. That incidental storage, as introduced, would still be allowed because it's not a whole new use. But checking the rest of the code, this is the only place that incidental storage language is used, and therefore, council staff does not object to this amendment.
Okay, council staff does not object to this amendment. I appreciate that. I do think that this is a life sciences overlay zone, and so we should do what we can to make very clear that we're not trying to restrict legitimate uses to allow for life sciences to expand and to be super successful. What we want to do here is to have a life sciences community and area that is reflective of the demands of the marketplace and the interests of workers and residents. I think that that is very possible, and ideally, it's related to all the other items that we've been taking up here of, changing surface parking lots that are islands of buildings in a sea of surface parking lot into livable, walkable, accessible communities that are much more desirable. But we don't want to incidentally prohibit things that are needed to have a thriving biohealth and life sciences sector, and I think this seems to do that. Yeah. So looking at colleagues, it looks like there's agreement here, and since there's no objection from council staff, I won't ask if there's support, but there seems to be support from colleagues, which is good enough for me. So we will, without objection, accept this amendment that adds the language excluding incidental storage for medical, scientific, manufacturing, and production use. Let's continue.
So that was a great segue to number 5, which is life sciences and related uses. So Promoc Partners requested an amendment for their specific property, which is next to Adventist Hospital. It's 9711 and 9715 Medical Center Drive. So there's a requirement in the underlying LSC zone that on tracts greater than 5 acres, a minimum of 40% of the gross floor area must be for life sciences and related uses. So Promoc Partners' argument here was that removing this restriction would allow more housing, retail, and other uses. So looking at the ZTA and the intent of the master plan and the overlay zone as a whole, council staff does not recommend this amendment because while the overlay zone is supposed to promote new development opportunities, it is still an LSC zone. So we want to make sure we're still encouraging life sciences in this overlay, and the intent was not to modify the LSC zone itself. Further, there's a lot in the ZTA that does incentivize additional residential development. For example, there's a line that says the limits in the GSLS zone cap residential uses at 30% of gross floor area and retail at 15% do not apply. So there's various ways within the ZTA to still do more mixed use than is currently allowed. And then lastly, at the very beginning of the overlay zone, the first purpose listed is to attract and retain the life science industry. So while on its face it's a great suggested amendment because it allows that mixed use, keeping that LSC underlying zone language will make sure that it still stays a life science zone at its core.
Okay, it looks like no interest in moving forward an amendment here, that there is opportunity for mixed use, but that the primary focus is life sciences, so let's continue.
The next requested amendment is from Adventist Hospital requesting an exemption for hospitals from the BLT requirement. So this is something that exists in the current public benefits section of the code. And this is where the fact that we're also working on the incentive zoning update factored in. So in the incentive zoning update, the 3 LSC zone properties outside of this overlay are going to be exempted from optional method. And one of them is a hospital in White Oak. So they will not have to follow this requirement, and for that reason, council staff recommends retaining the exemption that currently exists in the current public benefit system. So that language is on page 7, and council staff does recommend that amendment.
Okay, without objection. Any views from planning staff?
Thank you. I just wanted to add that one possibility might be as the incentive zoning update. I know that as seen now is not suggesting to exempt hospitals that are in the CR zone, so that it might make sense to return to this amendment after the incentive zoning update has been passed in its final form, so that this can stay, roughly in conformance with the overall incentive zoning update, because this will have, this overlay zone will have to be amended once the final incentive zoning is approved, and that it would make sense to have, a hospital in this LSC zone have the same requirements as a hospital in the CR zone, so that it could match. The Great Seneca Plan did reduce the BLTs that are required. Under the old master plan, it was 50% BLTs were required to be purchased, and we reduced that to 7.5%, which matches, again, CR zoning in the rest of the county. So that would be the one recommendation, is that maybe this exemption could be looked at after it's decided in the overall incentive zoning update.
Yeah, appreciate that as an option, but what's the concern specifically of including except as provided under section 473 F1B2?
So, I guess that will be changed anyway, so I guess either way, you'll have to come back to it, so maybe it doesn't matter, but.
So if it helps, so the section 473 F1B2 will likely be changed when you do the incentive zoning update, because the numbering and where things are is going to move. So council staff has to work with planning staff on how we're going to do that, because there's this overlay zone, the Bethesda overlay zone is coming up, and it's possible you do the incentive zoning update before these overlay zones get approved. So either during or after the incentive zoning update, there will be some cleanup to make sure that references that are moved are fixed and retained based on what the council had voted on.
But isn't it much easier, just theoretically, isn't it much easier to have it in here if there's no problem and you haven't identified a problem? If there's no problem, which you've yet to identify, if there are going to be changes, theoretically, like we've done in a lot of other cases, we would have some type of omnibus package that comes before us that makes the technical changes to implement, and having the reference to 473 F1B2 would make it easier to say if 473 F1B2 becomes 47 F31B7, for instance, then it would be easier to change than if it says all. It would be much easier to miss in terms of making that change. I'm just trying to understand. It seems like there's no risk. It seems like there's a modest reward here. I'm trying to understand what the problem is.
No, I think that you're correct. I think what my issue is that the actual underlying issue of whether hospitals should be exempt is something that I think the incentive zoning update is going to bring up. There's an existing exemption in the way that we currently do public benefits for hospitals. The current incentive zoning update is recommending to remove that exemptions for hospitals in the CR zone, so just that it is discussed at some point.
Yeah, but either way, if 473 F1B2 changes,
Yeah.
including if it doesn't have an exemption at all,
then, yeah. No,
then you're going to change that too.
Yeah, I think that's fine, that just that it,
Wouldn't presuppose that either.
no, you're right, it would not. I don't.
So again, I mean, I hear your comments and the ramifications of the comments. I'm just still trying to understand what problem we would solve. We're solving a problem here from their perspective, and it doesn't seem like we're creating a problem from yours. Unless I'm missing a problem that I have yet to hear.
Carrie Sanders for the record. I think it's under your purview how you want to proceed. I think it's a matter of maybe discussing those other hospitals that's outside of this plan area as you consider it for the larger county. So I think you're making a call today about this particular site, which is fine, it's in this plan area. It's just something to think about for the other sites, the other hospitals and other plan areas in the county. So you can go either way. I think what we're
Are
just.
you suggesting that if we don't include this language, that the exemption is there anyway? Or are you suggesting that you don't want the exemption to be included at all? Or are you suggesting that that may be where you end up and you want it to be discussed in the broader context? There's three
Yeah.
dynamics
I
here.
think I was suggesting that the hospital in the LSC zone should just be in line with what is decided in the incentive zoning update.
Yeah, I know, but that's in the future. Forget about that for a minute.
I think we
What-
would,
what-
we
what-
would
what is your
suggest-
view right now?
Our policy.
Right
view
now,
is
in
that
this
they should
exact
not-
moment, based on exactly what is on the books today, at the passage of this, because that's all we can do. All we can do is what is before us. We can't look to the future of what we expect and hope to maybe do. We can
Our-
only do what's before us right now. Right now, based on what the law and the zoning code says, what is the position of planning staff
Our-
in terms of what the difference would be?
Our recommendation would be to not exempt the hospitals, or the hospital in this case, in the Great Seneca Overlay Zone. The modeling that was done to come up with the incentives and the kind of tiers was done understanding that there would be a purchase of BLTs, so it was kind of baked into the calculus of the value of the incentive, so that would be our recommendation.
Okay, that's different than what you said earlier, just to be clear. All right, so is the view that if we include for council staff, except as provided under section 473 F1B2, I read that as except as already provided based on the current zoning code exemptions. Planning staff is suggesting that this creates a new exemption if you include that language.
It retains the
that-
exemption that currently exists under the current public benefit system. It sounds like planning's intent was to not carry over that exemption.
And the hospital wants.
Which we haven't approved yet, Okay, so I think that there is a policy difference between where planning is and where the hospital is that we are going to have to work out. The question is whether we have to work it out right now in this potential amendment. My question remains, with or without this, what is the substantive difference right now, the moment we pass this, regardless of whatever happens with the incentive zoning update, assuming that nothing happens with that, and that whatever we do with that will happen subsequent to the passage of this zoning text amendment, because on the current timeline, that's what we're looking at, and all we can do is what is in front of us as legislators. What is the substantive difference today between including this language in red, except as provided under section 473 F1B2, or not including it and just saying all optional method developments, et cetera?
If you do not include it, so you do not have the language in red, no amendment, the hospital will not be exempted from providing the BLTs that are required in the rest of the overlay zone.
So this would override 473 F1B2. Okay, so there is a substantive difference. Okay. All right, any comments or thoughts from colleagues? Councilmember Joanna?
Yeah, I think council staff, the idea here was, you said you agreed with the amendment.
Council staff agreed with the hospital to include the amendment because it's consistent with the current system, even if it's not consistent with the overlay zone as it was initially proposed,
Which is to have an exemption
which is to have an exemption.
from the BLT requirement.
No, the overlay zone is to not have, would not have the exception as introduced.
And you want to hold off on the decision completely? Or, well, yeah, I think that's what I heard you said. Don't include the amendment, and then wait till what we decide down the line. But you substantively don't want it to happen.
It's actually more the opposite. It's actually, I mean, if we don't include the language, we are presupposing that the
That we're
direction that
going
we're
to go
heading
that
in is
way,
to
yeah.
implement what planning
Right.
has intended,
Right.
which is to say, we are not going to provide an exemption, and then we will equalize that lack of an exemption by changing 473F1B2
For
to
everybody.
not provide that exemption for all hospitals.
Right.
What the hospital is saying is, we haven't done that yet, and why should we be treated differently than the other hospitals in the CR zones? Keep it as it is currently, and if you make the change, we would make the change then. That's, I mean, unless I'm reading this wrong, that's the
Which
rub
is-
here. It's
which
whether
is-
we
yeah.
presuppose and begin the process of implementing what planning is intending in the Great Seneca Life Sciences Overlay Zone, and what they intend to mimic in the incentive zoning update to provide no exemptions to all hospitals, or whether we keep the status quo in this language and change it later.
Right.
Essentially.
And why do you think it's appropriate to not give the exemption, not continue the exemption?
Jessica McVeary for the record. I do want to note that what our intent was when we were looking at the percent of BLTs that was required in the LSC zone today. Optional method development is required to contribute at a rate equal to 50% of their incentive zoning, whereas for the CR zone, it's 7.5%. So our overall goal was to bring down that percent in the LSC zone to make it equal to the CR zone. So that's really, the heart of this section is really to make it so that the BLT requirement in the overlay zone is 7.5% rather than 50, which is a pretty significant decrease. And so that was sort of the heart of what we were trying to achieve with this, which was actually, we thought, beneficial. And, I think that this, our hope is
They
that,
can get, they don't want to have any
understood.
requirement. Obviously, not having any is better than 7.5%, right? So,
But there are also, I think, what we're trying to balance are, making sure that we're kind of coming out on the whole with the BLT
No, I get
and
it.
trying
Yeah, of
to
course.
balance those. So I think our preference was to bring it to the 7.5% rather than the 50, and that we were still gaining some level of BLT contributions.
right, but just one more question. They're currently, the 50 was never required because they're exempt. So I understand the framing, but you're like, everyone else pays 50, so we're just trying to get at least something from them. Is that a fair framing?
Trying to bring it in.
Trying to equalize for everybody. You're bringing it down for everyone else,
Yeah,
and then you want to bring them up,
to make it sort of.
make it equal for
It's just
everybody.
sort of simple and equal across the overlay zone.
Okay. But currently, they don't have to do it. Okay, yeah. I would just say, let's not presuppose and just keep it as is until we move to the next thing, would be my thought.
So that would require the amendment.
Correct.
Okay, Councilmember Jawando thinks we should do the amendment, which is the Adventist Hospital and the council staff suggestion. Planning wants to keep it as they have introduced it. Councilmember Fani Gonzalez. And we'll see if I have to break a tie.
I don't have any hard feelings either way, to be honest. The proposal from planning staff makes more sense to me, to be honest with you. So, but really, either
I don't
way-
have terribly strong feelings here.
Yeah.
I do think that there's a lot on BLTs that is a separate conversation that we need to have and have begun having, and is a very sensitive issue as well. I am sensitive to Adventist Hospital's concern. I do think that going from 50 to 7.5 is significant. I am a bit compelled here on the fact that the modeling was done at 7.5%, and that we are trying to implement the overlay zone here, and that was part of the view of the overlay zone. So I think in light of that, I have been convinced in this discussion, since it was already modeled and is part of the overlay zone, and I see this as really the intent here is to implement the overlay zone, and the work that we had, previously done through policy. So I will agree with planning. I think that we should keep it as was, as was introduced. So that would be 2-to-1 on that. Oh, this was a very respectful view, and I'm not sure that there's such strong feelings here, because I think we can address this in other ways, perhaps down the road. But we'll keep it as was introduced for now. I will, say publicly for anybody watching, if Adventist or anybody else has compelling arguments to make before we, finalize this at full council, there will be an opportunity to do that, and we can revisit this amendment at that time. But for right now, I think we should keep it as was introduced. That's fair? Fair depiction?
Either way, council staff will make a note to address the hospital issue when we do the incentive zoning updates.
Yes, that's going to be a big issue.
And just since it's not an amendment going forward, if it could just be noted that the position of the committee members.
Yeah, it's 2-to-1, yeah,
Yeah,
as it
yeah.
should be reflected, yeah. All right, it'll be reflected in the packet as 2-to-1. Good discussion here. I think that is the final discussion decision point, but let me,
Well, there's always our.
oh, sorry, the technical amendments, I apologize.
I
It's
object to this.
It's the final substantive issue, but let me turn it to council staff for technical amendments.
So the technical amendment here was generated by us, kind of by the scheduling. So when we draft ZTAs, we draft them based on the current code. ZTA 2404 was introduced after this one, but passed before and shifted the sections around, since this is adding a section. So there's gonna be some renumbering and removing and correcting of various cross-references because they were approved out of order. So that's the technical amendment for this.
All right, without objection, the committee agrees to the need to adjust the references to the zoning code to make sure that it is current. So we'll authorize you to do that.
Sorry, I just moved my paper and remembered that we also had an addendum, which is an additional sort of technical amendment. So planning staff let council staff know that during the planning board discussion, there was discussion of a line that says developments must use all gross floor area allowed by the mapped underlying zone before receiving additional density. And the planning board had questions about whether this was whether you had to do your full commercial and residential FAR to get the additional density. The intent was it's one or the other. So that language is in the addendum, and it would add the phrase allowed by the mapped commercial or residential FAR of the underlying zone. So that was, sorry, one more amendment.
Okay, without objection? All right, without objection, we'll accept that as a technical amendment as well, and I believe that is it. Okay, unless there's anything else from planning, we have that. We will forward this along to the full council with 3-0 support from the committee, and we'll get this scheduled and hopefully approved in due time. And then, bless you, on to the incentive zoning update.
Yeah,
The minor task.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is really important for the county and the county residents. We want to incentivize and jumpstart more economic development, and this is a great place to do it, so thank you.
Absolutely. It's a key sector. It's not just central to the county. Geographically, it's central to the county in terms of our growth opportunities and our strengths in the economic sector of, life-changing, life-saving, and also, economy improving conditions in the life sciences sector, and something that we rightfully are very proud of and need to build upon in Montgomery County. So this is an important step in that direction, and appreciate the collaboration between planning and council staff and our private sector and healthcare partners on this. It's an ongoing, continued effort, and look forward to continuing the conversation at full council. With that, we are adjourned.